Cannabis stocks have been among the best performers this year. And the thinking is maybe it's time for federal legalization of cannabis. So with me, two experts here to talk about this. We've got Keith Stauffer, the CFO of TerrAscend, and also Matt Carnes, the founder of GreenWave Advisors, to talk about this industry. It's really been a hot industry so far this year. Keith, let's start with you. So we've got a new administration in the White House, one that is at least perceived to be friendlier to cannabis regulation, a Democrat House now as well. So, I mean, what do you think this might mean for the cannabis industry?
Hi, Jane. Thanks for having me. First of all, it's tough to kind of take bets on where the government's going to head. But I think if I were just to say what would be best for a company like TerrAscend or other multi-state operators in the U.S. in the industry, I think the first changes would be centered around banking reform and tax reform, 280E tax. And then the third would be some ability to uplist to U.S. exchanges. So if I just take the first couple first and take banking reform and tax reform and just apply it to the TerrAscend example, just the hard cash savings from those two types of changes could equate to north of $1 billion of enterprise value increase.
So, Matt, I mean, we saw in November, 4 or 5 states pass varying legalizations of marijuana. It was South Dakota and Arizona, and I'm trying to remember all of them. There were several. Do you think that this will lead to more growth? And what is the size of the industry and the expected growth?
Sure. Well, thank you also for having us this morning. I would say that, yes, more states legalizing will contribute to the growth. It takes probably about a year or so, year to 18 months for a new market to get implemented if there was no existing market. So in the case of this past election, we had Arizona and New Jersey, 2 existing medical markets that are robust, that are, Arizona actually has already started selling recreational use. So there'll be a quicker ramp up in sales and revenues, going into this year and next. The size of the market last year, estimates are estimate about $20 billion for 2020, and going into this year, roughly about $25 billion. Most of that growth, again, is other states that have implemented a couple of years ago are starting to ramp up, and as well as the new states that have come online. So most of the growth is coming from new states, and then those existing states, we're starting to see some real organic growth year over year. And so, longer term, I mean, my crystal ball only goes out maybe 2 years. I think it's really hard to handicap year by year at this point because we're very close to the end zone. So I would just say, I look at the market now just after going to 2022, out to about, I would say the market at maturity is about $70 to $80 billion.
Now, Keith, you talked a little bit about, listing on some of the major exchanges, ETFs. I mean, what are all the barriers for this industry? And then also, what are the different ways that investors can play in the cannabis space, so to speak?
Yeah, maybe a couple elements there. So there are new ETFs. For example, there's an ETF MSOS, which is multi-state operator. That's where that comes from. It's a New York Stock Exchange traded ETF. So that's a good way to play the sector, and it's on a major exchange. Like I mentioned earlier, the barrier is just that companies like ours and other leading multi-state operators trade on Canadian exchanges. And so once the laws are rewritten and providing a pathway to uplist to NASDAQ or NYSE, then definitely that the barriers come down, the capital flows into these companies more readily, and that provides more investment to continue to expand the sector and continue to expand the operations of these companies.
Now, Matt, I mean, how should potential investors or people who are in this industry how should they watch it? How should they invest in it? Is it too late? I mean, we've seen a big run up in cannabis stocks already this year. And then what should they look for when looking for cannabis companies?
Well, first of all, I would say it's not too late. It just really depends on your time horizon. If you think of it in terms of just where we are in the industry's growth, if we are at 20 billion last year and it's expected to go to 80 billion plus, we're like maybe even not even a quarter way there. So as much as these stocks have run, I really don't think they're valued to maturity at this point. So there's a long way to go. Now, can I predict the bottom and now get in? No, I mean, obviously there's volatility, but if you're in for the longer term, you really can't go wrong in many of these multi-state operators that have started to demonstrate real operational efficiencies and improvement. And what I would also say is once prohibition ends, as I was saying earlier, there is a cost of prohibition, right? There's a high tax rate, there's compliance costs. Keith would know better than I, really all the nuts and bolts that are behind everything. But really, once prohibition ends, and folks like TerrAscend, companies like that, and some of these other MSOs that are demonstrating free cash flow generation, once you get rid of all these prohibition costs, the free cash flow profile of these companies really dramatically will accelerate, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, it certainly feels like the stars are getting aligned for this industry and various things. It is becoming more publicly accepted. And we've got a patchwork now of states that have various ways of legalization, and perhaps federal will come at some point. So once we get through the pandemic. Well, thank you so much, Keith and Matt, for joining us and explaining this I know a lot of people are really interested in this industry. So thank you so much.
Thank you.